Welcome back to the Let's Go podcast, where we kind of dig a little more into the text, and we say around here, love God, live like Jesus, serve others. It's our mission statement. And then we say, let's go. So the Let's Go podcast, we're here to just dig back into the text and kind of talk a little bit about this week's text. So why don't we give just a quick overview of what's happening in this promise text, this covenant text. There's a bit of a strange ritual. There's all sorts of stuff. So let's just do a quick little overview of these chapters in Genesis, or this chapter in Genesis 15.
Yeah, well, so we're Genesis 12. There's the promise, the initial call, and all of that stuff, and then there's they are going into Egypt. Elias says, Sarah's my sister, all that stuff. And then Juan covered in 13:14, just kind of the Lot episode where the promise was that he would have land and he would have an inheritance, and then he would have descendants and all that stuff. And so in 13:14, we kind of see this like, oh no, the land promise is compromised with Lot, and then God shows up, and Sodom and Gomorrah and Melchizedek and all of that stuff. And so Abram has a little bit of confidence about the land, and then you get to 15, and there's this promise of God. A word from the Lord came to Abram. Don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your very great reward. And then Abram asked this, well, how? I don't have an heir, right? Eliezer of Damascus is going to be my heir. And so how does that work? How's that going to work out? So after he's questioned the land, now he's questioning the offspring, descendants, and all of that. And so God says, we're going to cut a covenant, and I want you to go and get these animals and cut them in half, and aligns them on either side of the road. And, in verse 6, Abram is credited righteousness apart from anything other than the fact that he believed that the Lord would give him an heir. And so God sets up this covenant, and then puts Abram into a deep sleep, and God appears in a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch, and we have this scene where what makes sense would be for Abraham, who's the weaker party in the instance, to walk through the covenant and basically say, hey, if this covenant fails, so shall be done to me, being cut in half, sacrificed, as was done for these animals, to these animals. And what happens is Abram is put into a deep sleep as he's waiting on God to show up so he can walk through the pieces in the presence of God. And when he's in a deep sleep, God himself walks through the pieces. So as for God to say, if this covenant fails, so should be done to me, shall I be sacrificed. Mm-hmm. And just this really powerful episode that's easy for us to miss because we don't get the ancient ritual, and it's kind of odd and all of those things. And so we see God lock in his covenant with Abram.
Yeah. Juan, what were kind of your main movements of your sermon that kind of come out of this text?
Yeah, that moment when that torch was passing through the pieces, I think about, and I made sure to hit this point, is just like God saying, hey, this is the agreement we're making, this covenant, this pact, is that I'm the one going through this. Is like if like this doesn't happen, if this promise is broken, Abraham, it's not on you, it's on me.
Yeah.
And knowing that, and to know that nothing that Abram could do could fulfill, right? Doesn't matter how much, if we look at works, if we look at what things he could do to fulfill his end of the deal, is like us saying, no, this is completely on me. And we think about, our relationship and the pact, that, the covenant that we have through Christ, and his death on the cross is like, this is right. This is where it's fulfilled. Right. And it's just your faith in the Son of God. So I thought that was really important, and made sure to hit that.
Yeah, there's so many details. We talked about this several weeks ago. So many details in the Old Testament. And there are familiar passages in the Old Testament, but I would say with this text, the familiar part of this text is this promise, this covenant, but as we get into the details, you get into this kind of strange ritual, but there's such beautiful connection to even to Christ and his sacrifice on the cross for us through this vision that Abraham has of God. And so I'm curious if we can just break in a little bit before we kind of get to the cutting room floor stuff, what didn't make it, if we could talk a little bit more about ancient Near Eastern culture Hunter, you touched on that, and we say, and I love how you said when we say ancient Near Eastern culture to a seminarian, that's a very common thing,
Yeah.
but we don't talk about ancient Near Eastern culture. This is just a way that we talk about the time of Abraham or the time of
back
of
in
the Bible.
Abraham's day.
And
right.
so there's a couple of things to understand about that. First, just this is a book written to a different kind of people than us, but it's not written. It's written in a different way, but it's also written for us.
Yeah,
but it's
right.
not written to us. And so there are some details in the text that maybe go without saying that would to an ancient Near Eastern culture or like a collective culture.
Right.
We're in more of an individualist. So I'd love for you to kind of just talk a little, and let's make it a little simple. It sounds crazy, but it's really not that complex.
It's not that complex. It just is different. And you're right. There are things in this text and every text that we engage in Scripture that would have been obvious to the original audience that just aren't to us. And so the reason that it's a big deal that God walks through the pieces instead of Abram is because they would have understood patron-client relationships, right? The way that their social world worked is there weren't banks and there weren't insurance agencies and famines would hit and things like that, and they needed coverage from people and unity to people, and this would be true of individual parties but also nations, right? And that's, you may have heard suzerain, vassal, if you've ever like an intro to world history and that kind of stuff. But so basically how it worked is I told this illustration of a baker loses his bakery. It burns down, and he needs, I have no way to get this back up. This is my livelihood. This is everything. And so he would go to a patron who then would fund and promote and relaunch the bakery. And this is grace. I'm not saying this is a grace. I'm saying this literally is where we get the word grace. That's what grace means, is that gift from the patron that the client could never pay back, the baker could never pay back. That's where we get grace. And the client, though, he could never pay it back, but he lived his life then in faith to the patron. And faith means that the client would live honoring and praising and in gratitude because he knew I could never pay this back to the patron. And so I'm going to be loyal. When the patron needs me to use my gifts to bake them goods, I'm going to bake them goods. And when he needs me to go and do something for him, I'm going to go do something for him because I could never pay him back for the gift that he has given me. And so in this text in Genesis 15, God is the patron. He's the stronger party who has given Abram a grace. He has called him and said, I'm going to make you a great nation. If you can't count the stars, so shall your offspring be. And so Abram should be committing his life to following God, and he naturally will return God's grace with faith. And we see God do an act when he walks through the covenant pieces that is just gracious beyond what you would expect or what really even makes logical sense to us. He's already been gracious enough to say he's going to bless him and all that stuff. And so now Abram is indebted with faith and ought to return to God the faith that God is due.
Right, and you connected it to Romans chapter 4, which now I would recommend to anyone that, as we've thought about this text in Genesis 15, go back now with all the kind of knowledge you're gaining about this whole situation, this whole ritual that God goes through, this sacrifice and the vision, and go and just reread Romans chapter 4. I was listening to it yesterday, and you talked about grace and faith, and where kind of those words come from. And now that we understand this part of this patron and client relationship, the text of Romans 4 comes alive in a new way, wouldn't you say? And so he really focused on this grace and faith moment of talking about, the patron gives you grace, or the is patron,
Yeah.
is that the right word? Yeah,
Patron
so
gives you
patron
grace.
gives grace, and we in turn return faith.
And so the phrase, I have been saved by grace through faith, is invoking this patron-client relationship for the ancient world that they would have understood. Oh my goodness, I have been saved by the unreturnable gift of God, and so I will return to Him to the best of my ability, the faith that I have, which is different than a version of the gospel in which I received in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, which was I'm saved by grace through faith. Just means you're saved by the gracious gift of God, and your faith is that you pray a prayer or acknowledge that God is God in your head, and it has no ramifications on the way in which we live our life. And I just don't know that to be true based on this framework.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because we can use the word faith in a very different way than it's actually presented in the text. What are your thoughts on some of that, Juan?
Yeah, I mean, and I even hit on that idea of faith, because God was establishing this foundation with Abram, right? Where he was building on the future of the belief of the Hebrew people, and he's building that foundation where Abram, you don't understand everything that's happening, but just trust in me.
Yeah.
Have that faith that we together will get this promise through. And all you have to do is just trust in me. And I hit John 6 and talked about how Jesus was teaching a really hard, lesson about flesh and blood and consuming it, and people walked away that were following Jesus, and I could just think about these people, like, who is this guy, right?
Yeah.
Who's this Jesus? And even though we don't understand the whole thing, Jesus says, just believe, just have that faith, and that's so important to us. And I think that there's so many of us that really don't understand everything, and it kind of hinders us. It kind of holds us back to say, I'm not willing to be able to completely, right, just surrender because I need to know more, and we need to be careful with that, because that's kind of where faith comes in.
Right.
That's where faith comes in.
Right. Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him.
Yeah. And to push into the faith idea go back to the bakery illustration, is if the baker is thinking, I don't have flour for tomorrow's baked goods, right? I don't have the materials that I need, and he would go to the patron and say, I need some help. I don't have the thing that I need for tomorrow, and the patron would provide the goods that they need. And this for us is a model for how in which we trust the Lord for the daily things that we need. And man, when you don't have that flour and you need the flour, and then the next morning you get there and the flour's there, how much, like, man, this changes my. I'm happy. I'm thankful, and all of those things. And so faith is this kind of active working gift.
And it's this thing we give to God in trust. I think I now know that I did not deserve what He has given me. And then He has given me grace. And because of that, faith is what we return to Him as trust. And that means, we talk about how do we put this text on, and how do we apply this text to our life, when we recognize that our relationship with God has everything to do with this grace and faith dynamic. We think of this text, which comes from the Ephesians text, for us by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It's a gift of God, so that no one can boast. You don't boast in your faith. You boast in the patron, in the God that
and
provided
the grace
for you.
Well, and
you boast in the grace.
Yeah, and if I own a bakery and Juan makes swords, and his sword shop burns down, right? This was the illustration. Then Juan's going to be like, man, I don't know what to do. And I'm going to say, dude, I got a patron that you need to meet, and he's got grace that's good enough for you. And that's the way in which we live our life.
Yeah.
And that as that promoter and witness for.
Yeah, it's a powerful text. What didn't make the cut? What were some things, maybe one that you read or you thought about that didn't make it in your sermon, but you would have liked to kind of explore a little further in this text?
There was a moment in the scripture where, Abram was frustrated with God. He's like, you promised us, we'd have a son, and we haven't had a son. And he says, it looks like my slave I think Eliezer from Damascus,
Damascus, yeah.
is going to be my heir. And I would have been interested just to, dive into that a little bit. Like, who was that guy?
How did he pick up somebody from Damascus? You talked a few weeks ago about the Hagar, which will be the sermon for next week. Hagar's an Egyptian slave, probably came from Egypt. Where did this guy come from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, did he come from, the people he rescued when he rescued Lot? I don't know. So
Yeah, he's done a
it's
lot
just-
of traveling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and that was one for me. I didn't read. I just kind of paraphrased 13 through 16, where there's this prophecy for the Egyptian Exodus, right, for 400 years, and you'll be mistreated, and there's a lot of power in that text that I just didn't push into. Also in verse 11, then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And so I made the point that, okay, he was waiting on God, obviously, because it was long enough for birds of prey to come down, like vultures and all that. But I read a lot about the prophetic nature of this text leading into the Exodus. And so, hey, your covenant will be tested, like birds of prey. Let's say that those are, that's Egypt, in that Egyptian slavery, is going to test and pick at and try to destroy this covenant before it could even be made. And I think that I think that there's a sermon there that I just didn't have time to.
But also in that moment, I think it's a really, really important detail. The birds of prey come down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. Like, maybe God tells you to do something, and so you do it, and you're like, okay, Lord, like, what now?
Yeah.
And you just have to wait. And it's like this. I could see that preaching a little bit, just like, wait on the Lord. He's coming, but that doesn't mean that you have to just sit there and allow, the whole thing to be ruined. Like, waiting doesn't necessarily mean just sitting and looking. It's
You're
like,
watching over, yeah.
you're watching
Yeah.
over this
good.
thing. So
That's-
that's good.
that's
How about
good.
you, Hunter? Anything
Yeah, so there's that, and then
else?
I didn't mention it all, and I don't know. I was so bad at the maps and the geography and all that stuff. Whenever you shared the maps a few weeks ago, people were like, "Wow, that was nice. You should share more maps." And I was like, "Guys, I just can't do it." And so I didn't even read all the Izites and lands and all that stuff. But I'm sure that there's a lot of power in just those stories and texts, and these cities all connect because the land in which Jesus enters into is this same land that his people have a history in, and there's richness in understanding that history that I'm weak on, honestly.
Yeah, we have. There's so much detail in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
and there's so much time you can spend really digging into all of not only but like the archaeology of things and like the landscape of things, not just the map, but the landscapes. Like we talked about things you don't necessarily understand in the text. Well, they may mention like an area or something, and to someone that understands the archaeology of that place, that means, that's
It's
like saying,
so significant,
oh,
yeah.
well, Juan went down to Houston, and you're like, oh man, Houston is so hot and humid. Like, we would know that. It's not in the text, but we would know that. It's like Hunter. Oh, Hunter goes to Mississippi.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't go to Mississippi on purpose. There's a lot of reasons, and I wouldn't recommend.
See, and
I had a flat tire in Jackson, and man, I just didn't know that I was ever going to make it out alive. They don't have water right in there.
Yeah.
I also would say one of the things that like I would like to preach a sermon on is just this. After all the stuff that Juan preached about a few weeks ago with Abram and Lot and the king of Sodom, God says, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." And there's a translation that's, "I am your shield, you will receive a very great reward." And just to make this argument that, man, God is the great reward that we will receive. And how do you tangibly live that out? How did Abram receive that when he was like, what do you mean? I've got a lot of riches and stuff. You've given me cattle and all that. What do you mean you're the great reward? And is this the first time that he uses this phrase? And how does that impact us? That, man, God is the great reward at the end of the day, and we ought to live in acknowledgement of that.
I think that's a pretty good transition into this last little bit, which is kind of what's the let's go of this text as we walk our faith as disciples of Jesus? How does this text inform how we try to walk like Jesus?
Yeah, I think it's how are we handling our faith? How are we walking that walk? And it's important for us to tell God, I don't get everything. I want to learn more, but there's just so much that I don't know. But I'm trusting you, and that idea, Hunter, that you brought up of him waiting on God, and there's going to be moments that we're just not going to just be sitting there with our arms crossed. We're actively waiting, and that plays into how we look at God and how we trust in Him, and how we walk our walk is important.
Yeah. And we're going to see for the next couple chapters that still waiting on God, and it doesn't end here. The covenant is a good step, but now He's waiting for the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this process of our life is a lot of trusting in the timing of the Lord.
Yeah.
And man, He's brought me to this place which I prayed for and I was eager for, and then you get to that place and you're like, oh, what's the next What's the next thing? What's the next place? And just trusting the Lord in all of that. I think, like Juan said, our practical living out faith, living in faith. I think for me, one of the inventory things that I need to do in light of the text is I need to remember my need for grace. And because if you don't appreciate the grace of the patron, you can forget why you have faith in that patron, why you return obedience and all that. And the Lord has brought me so far in my life. I need to regularly sit down and take an inventory of just all the things that He's done, so that I can be thankful to Him. Because and maybe this is just me, but one of the sick and twisted things about how good God has been to folks, and I've been in the pits even in the last couple of years, had real seasons in the pits that by the grace of God I don't think about now.
Yeah.
But one of the sick things is that, and Paul says it in either Galatians or Ephesians 3. He's like, you think that you've gotten this far by the Spirit, you will now continue on in the flesh. And I can convince myself, man, I think that my own gifts got me here. My own talents blessed my family. And I just have this tendency to forget the gifts that God has given to me and how He's brought me along. And I need to take an inventory of, man, just to sit down and pray and remember all the ways in which the Lord has provided.
Right. I think just overall, this text reminds us to take the next faithful step, whatever that step is of faith. And sometimes there is a tendency to, maybe you're in a season of waiting, maybe you're in a season of uncertainty, but what is a step you can take? God's not always, he sent him all these instructions of how to make this deal, and then we talked about the birds of prey. So he went and did that thing because God had asked him to do that. And I spent a lot of time praying a prayer from my sabbatical, and I've shared it with folks, but it still is on me, which is just, the line of the prayer is trust the slow work of God.
Yeah.
His timing is not often aligning with ours, and so we often want to say to the patron, hurry up, let's do this, and God is just there. His time is not our time. And so for us, we just need to ask God, what is a step I could take?
Yeah.
And see where He leads you, because you won't, you're not going to get somewhere taking a step, but you take a lot of little steps, you'd be surprised at where He'll lead
Amen.
you. So yeah, what do we have to look forward to this week? We got
Hagar's in the mix now, so
we're starting to get into some more of the familiar territory, and how does we have these moments of, oh yeah, I remember that story, and oh yeah, well, what is going on here, and oh yeah, I remember this part of the story. So we've got what do we have this week?
It's the Hagar story, Genesis 16. I mean, Juan finished the sermon years ago, I'm sure, but I'm still I'm wrapping it up today, and I think it's going to be on the cutting room floor, but this story looks a lot to me like Adam and Eve and the apple in the garden. You just, instead of Adam and Eve and the apple, you have Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And
All right.
really, really interesting parallels to me.
Fun to get a glimpse. Well, thanks, guys, for looking at that. Thank you for watching.
Yeah.
And we would love to talk about the text with you. So if you have questions, come ask us. We love talking about this stuff, and it's an honor to just do this with you guys. So thanks for joining us. And as we say, our mission statement together, you go off and live as disciples of Jesus. Take another faithful step, and we'll see you next Sunday. So we say, love God.
Live like Jesus.
Serve others. Let's go.
Let's
Vamos.
go. Vamos.